Robert William Picton and his brother David liked to think of themselves as simple country folk. The pair owned a small suburban farm in western Canada, about 7 miles east of Vancouver, and for many years, they made a meager living in selling their produce over in the big city. For a long time, the brothers seemed perfectly content to live the quiet life of a farmer, but sometime in the mid-90s, the Picton brothers seemed to tire of country living. They began to seriously neglect the farm's operations, which had a devastating effect on their productivity. Robert in particular began to have bizarre mood swings, and his behavior around the farm grew steadily more concerning. An employee of the Pictons named Bill Hiscox said Robert used to be a pretty quiet guy, but his strange new personality frightened the farm workers. Bill also mentioned that the farm became a creepy-looking place over time, but that he needed the money too much to put in his notice. But instead of knuckling down and getting the farm's operations in order, they thought up a scheme to fund what would become an increasingly wild lifestyle. In 1996, the brothers registered a non-profit charity with the Canadian government named the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. In their mission statement, they claimed to organize, coordinate, manage, and operate special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions on behalf of service organizations, sports organizations, and other worthy groups. The Canadian government then approved the payment of a grant to the Piggy Palace Good Times Society, and Robert and David were flushed with free government money. But instead of using the cash to help worthy groups, as they put it, they used it to throw wild parties in a converted slaughterhouse that stood on the property. These parties were attended by none other than the local chapter of the Hells Angels, along with scores of Vancouver escorts, and were known to attract as many as 2,000 people at a time. But it seems that the Pictons' parties got a little too wild, and on March 23, 1997, Robert Picton was arrested by Vancouver Police Department on charges of attempted murder. The alleged victim was an escort named Wendy Lynn Eistetter, who had been stabbed several times during an altercation which occurred at one of their many charitable events. Picton insisted the stabbings were in self-defense after Wendy attacked him with a broken bottle, the claim he could back up since he also walked away from the confrontation with serious injuries. But Wendy had a different story entirely, asserting that she had only attacked Robert after he had attempted to handcuff and kidnap her. Not only had she managed to escape the handcuffed attempt, she also disarmed Robert of the knife he was threatening with, which is what she then used to inflict the wounds that sent him to the hospital. Despite the obvious indications of Robert's insidious predatory nature, the fact that both had wounds meant that police and judicial officials alike believed it was nothing more than a tit-for-tat lover's tiff that happened to turn bloody, and on January of 1998, the charges were dismissed. But the negative press forced the brothers to shut down the Piggy Palace Good Times Society after its non-profit status was removed after a federal financial committee was unable to procure financial statements. Yet fraud, zoning violations, and debauched biker parties weren't the only thing the Picton brothers were up to, and farm worker Bill Hiscox had begun to notice something chilling. Over the years, Bill had noticed that many of the young ladies who visited the farm seemed to just vanish. They'd walk down the driveway of the farmhouse, all smiles and sunshine, asking for a job or if they could pick fruit or if they could feed the pigs. Robert Picton would smile back, say, "Sure, why not?" and invite them inside. But Bill noticed that despite lots of young women walking into the farmhouse, not many of them seemed to come out again. Over time, Bill began to seriously worry about what was going on in the Pictons' farmhouse. He'd have to wait 4 long years to get any answers, and when he did, they'd only confirm his worst fears. On February 6, 2002, Vancouver police executed a search warrant for illegal firearms at Picton's farm, who were rumored to be engaging in weapons trafficking in partnership with the Hells Angels motorcycle gang. Robert and David were arrested, and an intensive search of the farm was conducted. The cops were only looking for unlicensed rifles and signs of illegal automatic conversion, but instead, they discovered something far more disturbing. Based on their grim new discovery, police quickly obtained a second warrant to search the farm in conjunction with officers from the British Columbia Missing Women's Investigation. Personal items belonging to several different girls were found in Robert's possession, and the farm was subsequently sealed off for excavation. When specialist forensic investigators arrived at the Picton farm to begin the exhaustive process of digging through the dirt, they figured it would make for grim work. But they couldn't have imagined the sheer scale of Robert's evil, which would only be evidence in the number of bodies they found. Police were slow to release information to the public, but on February 22nd, Robert was arrested and charged with the murders of Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson. 6 weeks later, 3 more charges were added for the murders of Jacqueline McDonnell, Diane Rock, and Heather Bottomley. A 6th charge for the murder of Andrea Joesbury was laid on April 9th, followed shortly by the 7th for Brenda Wolfe. In September, 4 more charges were added, with another 4 murder charges laid on October 3rd, which brought the total number of homicides to 15. Then, on May 26, 2005, 12 more charges were laid against Picton for the killing of a dozen more women, bringing the total number of first-degree murder charges to 27. It was the largest investigation of any serial killer in Canadian history, costing more than 70 million Canadian dollars by the end of 2003, and was partly so expensive because of the process of forensic analysis and victim identification was so difficult and drawn out. Many of the bodies had been underground for years, exposed to the raw earth and all its necrophagic creepy crawlies. Other corpses were fed to the collection of pigs that the Pictons kept. The fact that such a neglected farm had such fat, well-fed pigs speaks to what a prolific killer Robert was. This meant that some bodies were simply impossible to identify without the use of complex and expensive methods. For example, during the early days of the excavations, forensic anthropologists brought in some seriously heavy equipment, including 2 50-foot flat conveyor belts and soil sifters to find traces of human remains. But still, even after hundreds and hundreds of man-hours were poured into the excavation, it's not entirely clear just how many women Robert Picton really killed. Despite being officially convicted of 6 murders, some believe Picton could be behind the deaths of up to 49 other young women. What's more, there's evidence that Picton's depravity extended far beyond simple murder. On March 10, 2004, the Canadian government released a statement saying that Picton may have ground up human flesh and mixed it with pork that he sold to the public. This was followed up by the British Columbia Health Authority issuing a warning, confirming that their concerns were warranted. After Picton was convicted, many people started coming forward and talking to police about what was going on at the farm. One of the witnesses that came forward was named Lynn Ellingson, who claimed to have seen Picton skinning a woman hanging from a meat hook years earlier. She did not tell anyone about this out of fear for her life. Additionally, Ellingson admitted that she blackmailed Picton over the incident on more than one occasion, which only further secured her silence. The items police found inside Robert Picton's trailer also speak to how disturbed he was. Cops found a loaded .22 revolver with a Marshall 8 over the barrel and 1 round fired, boxes of .357 Magnum handgun ammunition, night vision goggles, 2 pairs of fox fur-lined handcuffs, a syringe with 3 milliliters of blue liquid inside, and some Spanish fly aphrodisiac. But even more disturbingly, police got their hands on a videotape which contained footage of Picton's friend Scott Chubb. In the short home video, Chubb is filmed saying that Picton had told him a good way to kill a female heroin addict was to inject her with windshield washer fluid. A second tape was also played at Robert's murder trial, in which an associate of his says Robert had mentioned killing escort workers by handcuffing and strangling them, then bleeding and gutting them before feeding them to pigs. On December 11, 2007, after reading 18 victim impact statements, British Columbia Supreme Court Judge Justice James Williams sentenced Picton to life with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The maximum punishment for second-degree murder, and equal to the sentence which would have been imposed for a first-degree murder conviction. As of 2015, the Picton farm had been completely fenced off to the public and is under lien by the Crown and Right of British Columbia. All the buildings on the property except a small barn had been demolished. The place will never stand as a sick memorial to one of Canada's most prolific killers. In the end, the place merely had the appearance of being a farm. A drove of pigs, a broken-down tractor, all things that might fool the ignorant. But in fact, the farm had become a cemetery for vulnerable young women who, as their killer knew, would barely be missed. It seems we like to think of Canada as America's friendly neighbor to the north, a land of bacon and apologies with a room temperature crime rate. But the idea is a myth, and the whitewashing of Canadian culture, or maple washing as it's come to be known, is a very real thing. There appears to be a deep well of evil in the great white north too, and it is just as deep and troubling as the one down here. In British Columbia, Canada, there is a 450-mile stretch of Highway 16, running between Prince George and Prince Rupert, that has become one of the most hauntingly ominous places in the entire country. Since the 1970s, the highway has been the site of a disproportionate number of murders and unsolved disappearances, especially of Indigenous Canadian women and girls. Law enforcement have attempted to explain the prolific nature of the disappearances, as well as the difficulty in investigating them, as being down to the widespread poverty, drug use, domestic violence, and poor social care. The poverty suffered by the people in the area leads to low rates of car ownership and mobility, meaning that hitchhiking is often the only way for people to visit family, go to work, or seek medical treatment. Another factor leading to abductions and murders in that area is largely isolated and remote, with soft soil and an abundance of carnivorous scavengers to carry away human remains. These factors make the area a prime hunting ground for violent criminals, as perpetrators feel a sense of impunity, privacy, and the ability to easily carry out their crimes and hide evidence. So much so that the locals have christened the stretch of road as the Highway of Tears. The grim nickname the Highway of Tears was coined during a vigil held in Terrace, British Columbia in 1998 by Florence Naziel, who was thinking of the victims' families crying over their loved ones. Publicity of the Highway of Tears was met with righteous indignation by the Canadian public, and in 2005, the RCMP launched a provincially funded project, EPANA, which started with a focus on some of the unsolved murders and disappearances of young women along Highway 16. EPANA sought to discover if there was a single serial killer at work or a multitude of killers operating along the highway. Accounts vary as the exact number of victims, and according to the RCMP, the number of victims is fewer than 18. However, Indigenous organizations estimate that the number of missing and murdered women is well over 40. One of the first young women to go missing on the Highway of Tears was Jenny Sampere, who vanished on October 14, 1971. Her cousin Alvin was the last person to see her near a bridge on Highway 16 in Gitxcoachla. He left Jenny to ride his bike home and retrieve a jacket, but when he pedaled back to meet her, he heard a pickup door slam. When he reached the road, there was no pickup and his cousin was gone. There was some speculation that Jenny ran away or took her own life after her boyfriend vanished, but her family disputed these theories. But regardless, her boyfriend's body was found drowned in the Skeena River not long after she disappeared. Then on July 3rd of 1976, pregnant 21-year-old Corrine Thomas was just days from giving birth when she was struck and killed by Richard Reddycop's truck as she was hitchhiking home. Both her and her unborn baby were killed. Numerous witnesses reported seeing Reddycop swerve to hit Thomas. Most of these witnesses were under the age of 16 and were taken into police custody where, after 3 hours of unsupervised interrogations, they were coerced by police to lie and say that Thomas was playing chicken with Reddycop's truck. The local coroner stated publicly that the death was a complete accident, but he later retracted his testimony after it was made public that he was let off with a lesser charge after the drunken hit-and-run death of an Indigenous man, which he was responsible for 10 years prior. The same coroner also presided over an inquest 2 years before in the death of Larry Thomas, who was killed by a vehicle operated by Reddycop's younger brother Stanley on the same road where Corrine was killed. A formal public inquiry found numerous witnesses who confirmed that Redikov's truck actually swerved to hit Thomas. Despite the inquiry, the Canadian government did not proceed with charges, citing insufficient evidence. But even a layman could see that it was the brothers' attempts at systematically murdering two members of the same family. Yet still, nothing was done about it. A breakthrough came in 1981 when 36-year-old Jean Mary Kovac's nude body was found in a watery ditch by a man gathering firewood around 40 kilometers east of Prince George on October 11th. Police said she died from 4 .22 caliber bullet wounds to her head and was last seen alive at about 1:30 a.m. on October 10th at the intersection of Old Caribou Highway and Highway 16 East. Not long after, 13-year-old Roswitha Fuchsbichler was reported missing, and her dead body was later found dumped in some dense woodland just north of Prince George. Her body had been mangled and mutilated, but she died from a single stab wound to the heart. She had been stripped naked, stabbed, and slashed before dumped. Police spoke to a man named Edward Isaac, who witnesses said had given Roswitha a ride on the same day she went missing. Shockingly, Edward later fully admitted to the young woman's murder, stating he had taken her life because he wanted to see what it felt like. His conviction was practically concrete by the time the police secured the testimony of his ex-girlfriend, who helped him dispose of the body. It was only that which prompted the full confession, otherwise the murders may have remained unsolved. Isaac was also convicted of Jean Mary Kovac's murder, who was sentenced to life in prison on May 11, 1987, and was believed that, in light of Isaac's arrest and conviction, that the steady stream of murders and disappearances around the Highway of Tears would cease. And for 3 long years that seemed to be the case. There were no more disappearances around Highway 16, and for a while, the police believed they'd got their man. Yet the illusion of peace was shattered in 1989 when an entire family, including 26-year-old Doreen Jack, was reported missing. The Jack family left their home on Strathcona Avenue in Prince George, heading to a logging camp, where they had been offered jobs and daycare for the children. Ronald and Doreen, along with their 2 small children, Russell and Ryan, were last heard from during the early hours of August 2, 1989, when Ronald called to check in on his mother in the Burns Lake area. Previously, it had just been individual people that had gone missing. This time it was a whole family. Not only had the true Highway of Tears killer not been caught, but they were stepping up the scale of their attacks to target entire families. Just a few months later, 18-year-old Marnie Blanchard was also reported missing, having been last seen leaving the Rock Pit Cabaret in Prince George. Witnesses claimed they spotted a girl matching her description entering a gray Toyota pickup truck at around 2 in the morning, but all they could see of the driver was that he had black, shoulder-length hair. The truck drove west down 2nd Avenue, disappearing into the night. Marnie was never seen alive again. Then, around 3 weeks after she was reported missing, a married couple named Wilfred and May Peckham were partaking in a little cross-country skiing on an unmarked road just west of Foothills Boulevard. Gliding through a serene winter wonderland on their well-worn skis was one of the couple's favorite festive activities. But on that particular occasion, they were to make a truly horrifying discovery. Lying just off the trail was a human corpse, so badly mutilated by hungry wildlife that it was completely impossible to identify by sight alone. The person's face and eyes had been entirely eaten away, their limbs were nothing but bloody stumps, and the abdominal cavity had been completely stripped of all soft tissue. It took X-ray and dental analysis of the corpse to identify it as that of Marnie Blanchard, the same First Nations girl that had gone missing just weeks before. February 5th of 1990 marked another grim landmark in the Highway of Tears murders. Up until now, the various killers had satisfied themselves with kidnap and close-quarters execution or vehicular homicide. But in the early morning of February 5th, Prince Rupert Fire Department received a call warning them of a fire at an address of 3rd Avenue West. Upon their arrival, they found the building completely engulfed in flames. The dark street echoed with the screams of a woman trapped on the 2nd floor of the building, but they were soon silenced by the black, choking smoke that billowed from below. Family members from 3 different generations died in a blaze that police discovered was the result of an arson attack. Helga Roshan, her daughters Sherry and Pauline, and their grandmother Kimberly Dumais all lost their lives in one fell swoop after being targeted during an overnight visit. It wasn't even the first time there had been an attempted arson attack on their house either, as the previous Halloween someone had thrown a burning rag into the family's porch, obviously hoping it would start a fire. Years later, surviving members of the Roshan family received a letter from an anonymous source claiming to be responsible for the arson. The author gloated that he had completely gotten away with snuffing out the lives of 4 innocent First Nations women, and that if he had the chance, he'd do it all again in a heartbeat. The fact that the letter came years later seems to rule out convicted serial killer Brian Peter Arp as a suspect in the arson attack. Brian was arrested and sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Marnie Blanchard and another woman, Teresa Umphrey, in the summer of 1990, and unless he wrote the anonymous letter from his prison cell years later, which is not entirely out of the question, the implications are highly disturbing. Brian Arp and Edward Isaac weren't the only killers attracted to the Highway of Tears area, drawn by their twisted desires to burn, crush, and kill. The location seems to continually attract those who wish to indulge in grim, murderous fantasies. But why? In September of 1990, the disappearances continued with 22-year-old Donna Charlie being reported missing. To the shock and horror of all who knew them, Donna's boyfriend was eventually arrested on suspicion of her murder. It seemed impossible. Donna and Jerry were a couple very much in love, and given Jerry's gentle nature, it seemed out of the question that he might have harmed a single hair on Donna's head. But when confronted with strong evidence of his guilt, Jerry Smollett admitted to murdering his girlfriend after their pair went on a weekend binge of marijuana, magic mushrooms, and hard liquor. The perennially kindly Jerry told police that he had no idea what came over him and could barely remember the event, but the fact remained. A guy that was immediately scared by the sight of blood had somehow found it in himself to cut off his dead girlfriend's head before burying her in a shallow grave near the motel they were staying at. Forensic investigators who excavated the site of the shallow grave found Donna's body, but were unable to locate her severed head. Jerry then told them he couldn't remember exactly what he'd done with it, but assumed he'd buried it along with the rest of her remains. For all intents and purposes, Donna Charlie's severed head is still out there somewhere, hidden in the woods around the Highway of Tears, just waiting to be found. The list of those who disappeared in the area goes on, with the last body of a murdered First Nations woman being found just a few months ago in August of 2020. It's clear that something about the area around the Highway of Tears has attracted countless murderers over the past 50 years or so. But why exactly they're drawn to such a place to ply their grisly trade remains a complete mystery. Or perhaps it's something in the psychosphere, something in the water that made a perfectly loving young man like Jerry Smollett turn into a bloodthirsty monster, capable of beheading a loved one whilst in a haze of hallucinogens. In June of 2016, after pressure from a number of First Nations advocacy groups, Canadian Transportation Minister Todd Stone announced that, as the result of collaboration across local communities, a bus service would become available along Highway 16, being jointly funded by the federal government and the government of British Columbia. A year later, a subsidized transit service began operations on alternating days along a 250-mile section of the highway between Prince George and Burns Lake. The idea of the bus service was to reduce the amount of hitchhiking that was occurring in the area, thus reducing the chances of kidnap and murder. But given that there had been 9 murders around the Highway of Tears since then, it's safe to say that those who wish to take the lives of the innocent have failed to be dissuaded. Because something keeps drawing killers to that particular area, and whatever that thing is, it doesn't appear it's going to cease anytime soon. Born in Alberta, Canada in the late 1970s, a young Mark Twitchell dreamed of directing big-budget Hollywood blockbusters. It's only fitting that Mark was born around the same time as the first Star Wars movie was released, as the series became a lifelong passion of his. so much so that in 2007, he actually directed a feature-length fan fiction movie set in the Star Wars universe named Secrets of the Rebellion. The film depicts a series of events that occur just a few days prior to those of the original film, and also happens to include a cameo from Boba Fett actor Jeremy Bulloch. Secrets of the Rebellion was shot in full but remains in post-production and is unlikely to ever see the light of day. The same goes for another short film that Mark tried to make named House of Cards, a horror movie filmed entirely in an Edmonton garage he'd rented. Yet Mark's films are forever doomed to remain in the editing phase because, aside from filmmaking, Mark seemed to foster another passion. It was one that was not only considerably more sinister, but one that would result in him being sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. About the same time that Mark was filming a short horror movie, a 38-year-old factory worker named Johnny Altinger was on top of the world. Having recently dipped his toe back into the dating pool, he was delighted to inform his colleagues that he'd actually managed to bag a date with a woman he'd met on Plenty of Fish. Given that Johnny believed he was well past his sell-by date, we can understand how excited he might be, and how eagerly he might agree to meet a woman he'd only just met online. Johnny's coworkers were happy for him and wished him luck with his budding romance, so much so that when he failed to show up for work one day, and they received an email from his account telling them that he and his date had eloped to Costa Rica, they were incredibly understanding. Sure, it'd take some extra work to cover his shifts, but love is love, and Johnny deserved happiness. Needless to say, Johnny's coworkers were heartbroken when they then received a resignation letter from him via email. They'd missed him, but it sounded like he'd been caught up in something of a whirlwind romance. It was impossible not to be happy for him. The only matter that remained was getting Johnny's forwarding address so his employers could mail his final paycheck to him. But bizarrely, Johnny didn't return their emails, and the likelihood of him being content to miss out on a hefty sum of money seemed extremely slim. Finally, after weeks of waiting and worrying, a handful of Johnny's friends broke into his apartment. They harbored a great deal of suspicion regarding their friend's little Costa Rican vacation and weren't prepared to just sit back and wait for the cops to do something. Yet the break-in only worried them even further when they found Johnny's travel luggage and passport still in his home. To them, it still wasn't entirely clear what was happening yet, but they knew it certainly couldn't be good. Johnny's friends went straight to the Edmonton Police Service with their foreboding collection of evidence, and it wasn't long before a homicide investigation was officially launched. By chance, one of the individuals interviewed in relation to Johnny's disappearance was none other than our wannabe Spielberg, Mark Twitchell. It appeared that Johnny had sold his car to Mark at some point in the previous weeks, and this might prove a rather fruitful lead. Mark might well be able to provide them with an insight into Johnny's state of mind, perhaps even recall something Johnny said that might point them in the right direction. The police had no reason to believe that Twitchell was a potential suspect, but they also knew that there was no way Johnny was in Costa Rica, unless he had smuggled himself across the border. So, when Mark mentioned that Johnny had expressed a desire to take a vacation, the police immediately became suspicious. The inclusion of such an obviously false assertion was enough for the police to arrest Mark Twitchell on Halloween of 2008 as a suspect in the murder of Johnny Altinger. As part of their investigation of Twitchell's involvement in the disappearance, police seized and analyzed all of his electronic devices. They hoped to find an incriminating text message, a sinister search history, anything to prove it was Mark who was guilty of the murder. The chances of finding anything were slim, and even then, proving its implications would be another task entirely. So, we can only imagine the pure shock of law enforcement officials when they found a document on Mark's computer that was simply titled Serial Killer Confessions. The opening passage of Serial Killer Confessions read as follows. This story is based on true events. The names and events were altered slightly to protect the guilty. This is the story of my progression into becoming a serial killer. The document went on to present an account of its narrator's planning, failed first attempt, and successful second attempt to lure a man to his garage and murder him, with fake online dating profiles used as bait. It also described the process of dismembering the body in attempts to dispose of the remains. It was a thinly veiled attempt to fictionalize what had evidently been a very real murder, as the account was so horrifyingly detailed that it was quite obviously a retelling of Mark's own experiences of murdering Johnny. Slowly, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Johnny lost his life so that Mark might be able to author a better true crime story. At his trial, Mark attempted to fabricate the idea that he had murdered Johnny in self-defense, and that the serial killer confession document he had authored was merely a coincidence. Yet, he was hard-pressed to explain another document that law enforcement had recovered from his laptop, one which was titled, "A Profile of a Psychopath." Despite his own insistence to the contrary, the prosecution argued that it was Mark's attempt to deeply analyze his own bizarre behavior and personality. This second document also detailed how, in the days leading up to Johnny's disappearance, Mark had purchased knives, plastic sheeting, saw blades, and a meat cleaver, all in preparation for creating what was described as a kill room in the rented garage. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence the jury heard was the plot of Mark's short horror movie, House of Cards. They were told that the movie centered around an unfaithful husband, one that was lured to a discreet location under the pretense he was meeting a woman from a dating website. However, once he arrived, he was attacked and killed by a masked man as punishment for his infidelities. Mark hadn't just killed a man so he could write about the process more accurately. He had staged a grim reenactment of his own short film. Once these details emerged, the police were contacted by a man named Gilles Tétral, a computer company contractor who seemed desperate to talk to them regarding the Mark Twitchell trial. Gilles told investigating officers that he too had been lured to a secluded location under the pretense of meeting a young man named Sheena, whom he'd been flirting with online for the past several days. But when he arrived, he found himself ambushed by a man in a hocket mask who attempted to subdue him with a stun baton. After a violent struggle, Gilles managed to escape, but did not report the attack to police out of sheer embarrassment. It was a clear replication of Mark's modus operandi, and suddenly, it became clear that Gilles was the one Mark mentioned in the first court document, a man the media dubbed the one who got away. As the trial progressed, the prosecution slowly pieced together a picture of who Mark Twitchell really was, a violent, deranged psychopath who masqueraded as a filmmaker, using the art form to recreate violent fantasies that he would later delight in making a reality. The jury had no problem finding him guilty of first-degree murder, and in April of 2011, Mark was given the maximum sentence by Canadian law, life in prison with no parole eligibility for a minimum of 25 years. But even after his imprisonment, grim details of Mark's fascination with murder and dismemberment continued to reach the ears of the public. Apparently, Mark's favorite TV show was Dexter, a series that chronicled the life of Dexter Morgan, a man with homicidal tendencies living a double life. He works as a forensic technician for the police department during the day, but after dark, he continues his work as one of Miami's most prolific serial killers. In May 2013, it was reported that Twitchell had purchased a television for his prison cell. Twitchell stated that he had caught up on every Dexter episode that he missed since he was arrested and convicted of first-degree murder. Word of Mark's love for the show was met with such revulsion by those that heard it that Dexter's lead actor, Michael C. Hall, was confronted with the news on a live radio show up in Canada. "I would hope the people's appreciation was more than some sort of fetishization with the kill scenes," he said. "And I wouldn't stop making Dexter because someone like Mark Twitchell was fascinated by it only in that way. I try to tell myself that their fixated nature would have done it one way or the other, but it seems that Dexter had something to do with it. It's genuinely horrifying." Perhaps Michael C. Hall is correct. Perhaps Mark Twitchell had fostered a fascination with the macabre, and that had long predated his love of Dexter, and was bound to hurt someone sooner or later. But there's also little doubt that the violent imagery presented in shows like Dexter have a very particular effect on some people. They act as triggers, making people like Mark want to turn their darkest fantasies into violent, permanent realities. Sometime before the year 1850, at a remote hunting camp in the Canadian Arctic near King William Island, a group of native Inuits were skinning and butchering their freshly caught game. Suddenly, one of the hunters spotted something moving through the dense, freezing fog. It was a sight that might well have been one of the most unearthly and chilling things ever to be seen by human eyes. A dozen decrepit figures lurched towards them through the snow, with vacant eyes and icy blue skin. None of the skeletal figures made a single sound as they moved, and to the Inuit, it was as if though they had materialized out of thin air. "They're not Inuit. They're not even human," one First Nations woman was said to have stated, her voice shaking with fright when she rushed to warn her people of the ghostly creature's approach. No sooner than she'd spoke, her family began to hear snow crunching under the boots of the skeletal beings that approached their igloo, and there was a horrifying moment of realization that the girl was speaking the truth. "Everyone got scared. Very, very scared," said Joe Haven shaman Nicholas Kayutinawak when he described the encounter, and we can easily understand why. These Inuit were among the most isolated people on Earth, and although they knew of Europeans, they had never met a white person. They had never even met any of the Dean people, another group of First Nations people who had made their home nearby, so it stands to reason that any incursion by outsiders would be met with anxious reactions, but to have a group of what they assumed were monsters invading their home would have been a truly horrifying experience. At last, when the ragged boots of the ghostly figures could be seen from the entrance of the igloo, an elderly member of the tribe went out to investigate. As the older man exited the ice-block shelter, he laid eyes on a figure who seemed so completely disoriented that at first, he didn't think the figure could even see him. The figure laid a gloved hand on the exterior of the igloo, apparently fascinated by the thing, and didn't resist when the older man reached out and touched the blue skin of their cheek. "Their skin was cold and blue as ice," the man later said. "I'd never in all my life seen a devil or a spirit. I've heard the sounds they make, but I've never seen them with my own eyes, not until that day. Those things weren't human." As it turned out, the ghostly skeletal figures were none other than the last survivors of the doomed Franklin expedition, sailors who had survived one of the most harrowing ordeals imaginable. The Franklin expedition was a British voyage of Arctic exploration led by Captain Sir John Franklin that departed from England in 1845 aboard two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The task assigned to them was to traverse the last unnavigated sections of the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic. The expedition was met with disaster after both ships and their crews, a total of 129 officers and men, became icebound in Victoria Strait near King William Island, in what is today the Canadian territory of Nunavut. After being icebound for more than a year, Erebus and Terror were abandoned in April of 1848, at which point Captain Franklin and almost 25 others had died. The survivors, now led by Franklin's deputy Francis Crozier and Erebus's Captain James Fitzjames, set out for the Canadian mainland and disappeared. The few that survived had buried their captain, witnessed their ship being swallowed by the creeping ice, and even eaten the flesh of their dead shipmates in order to survive. They were thousands of miles from home, lost and traumatized, having only escaped death by the narrowest of margins as they attempted to escape the Arctic on foot. To the native Inuits, the encounter with the starving, freezing men was one of the most terrifying of their lives. But to the Franklin survivors, the event was one of the most joyous occasions imaginable. They knew that they were still hundreds of kilometers from any fur trading post or whaling station that might have mounted any sort of rescue attempt. It was an incredible stroke of good luck, and although a handful of the expedition had now found salvation, scores had already fallen victim to the deadly frozen wastes. The survivors seemed far too weak to be dangerous, so a group of Inuit women tried to comfort the men by inviting them into their igloo. But being face to face with the skeletal figures only made the native women increasingly nervous. The survivors were painfully quiet, and although they were quite obviously starving, they refused to eat any of the Inuit food. They spat out the chunks of cooked seal that they were given, seemed repulsed by the pot of soup that the women had boiling away on a stove, and savagely held on to their meager belongings when the Inuit women offered to trade for some dried meat. When the men of the tribe returned from a seal hunting trip, they were so astonished by the condition of the survivors that they hastily constructed an igloo for them, built them a fire, and even outfitted the shelter with 3 whole seals. But then, after the survivors had gone to sleep, the Inuit were still so terrified of them that they quickly packed up their belongings and fled into the night. Whether or not their pale-skinned visitors were actually natives or from some other far-flung place, the group decided that staying too long around these strange skeletal figures with their iron knives might get them all killed. But in their haste to escape, the Inuit had abandoned several of their personal belongings, and when a small party went back to the camp to retrieve them, they found an igloo filled with corpses. The seals were untouched. Instead, the men had eaten each other. In the 1990s, Canadian anthropologists began to compile an oral history which detailed the age of Arctic discovery, but from the viewpoint of First Nations people. What they discovered was a plethora of haunting tales which recalled ghostly encounters with doomed men. The First Nations group of North America had encountered Europeans for the first time in all manner of different ways, but while groups in warmer coastal climates had communed and clashed with explorers who were well-fed and well-dressed, the Inuit people were more often encountering small, ragged groups who were on the verge of death. But it wasn't just their appearances that so disturbed the native Inuits. It was the behavior of the surviving Europeans that indigenous peoples found most alarming. Inuit hunters came back from trips into the wilderness with horrifying tales of pale, skeletal men who didn't seem to be right. And given that the Franklin survivors would have been ravaged by scurvy, botulism, or sheer desperation, we can understand their diminished mental state, but the details of their degradation are truly harrowing. Men raved in languages the Inuit couldn't understand, and although this was nothing more than a simple language barrier, it must have compounded the terror that the First Nations people experienced. One group of hunters came across some European survivors who had been sleeping for days in the hollowed-out corpses of seals they'd caught and killed. They were said to be so shriveled with hunger and so caked with frozen gore that they were barely recognizable as human beings. Another group of native hunters stumbled upon a small group of white men huddled together for warmth under a rocky outcrop. The men appeared to be eating strips of frozen meat that the hunters assumed was coming from a seal or perhaps a seabird, but when they got closer, they saw that the haggard-looking group were butchering and eating a human leg. Realizing they had been discovered, the Europeans barely reacted and simply carried on filling their stomachs with morsels of human flesh before they carried on southward. Morbid remnants of the expedition continued to be found by generations that followed, and as late as the 1960s it was still possible to stumble across a uniform skeleton, still carrying some variety of naval accoutrement. By the end of the 19th century, the coasts of King William Island were littered with the grim leftovers of failed expeditions. The deadly failures caused a national scandal over in Great Britain. The Brits imagined that if the expeditions had indeed been lost, then surely the survivors had met a noble British death. Yet hearing of good British sailors resorting to such savage means of survival was too horrifying to keep quiet about. Facing death from frost or hunger, thousands of miles from home, is most certainly a terrifying prospect. But it seems the doomed voyage was all the more terrifying for some of the native people of Canada, who, having never seen a stranger before, saw grim visages of famine stumbling at them through the icy fog. Some believed they were spirits at first, but they were wrong. It was death that visited them on that cold winter's day. Yermund Roseholt, Valerie Thuray, and their 10-month-old daughter Adele Roseholt all lived in a small log cabin northeast of Mayo, a remote community about 250 miles north of Whitehorse, the capital of Canada's Yukon Territory. The family had owned the cabin since 2015 and had flown there in the autumn of 2018 for the yearly wilderness vacation they took. The plan was to stay and trap animals to live off of until after the new year, when Thuray was set to return to her teaching job back in Whitehorse. The couple were experienced pair of outdoorsmen, skilled in bushcraft and extremely cautious of the risks involved in their unusual form of seasonal lifestyle. But in the end, no amount of experience could save the family from the grim fate that awaited them, and as the years went by, the family's luck would finally run out. On the morning of November 26, 2018, the family had a simple breakfast of fruit and porridge together before Yarmoun departed the cabin to check on the family's trap lines. Being able to provide for his family in such a primal, primitive manner was a huge source of pride for him, and he was extremely diligent in his work. But while Yarmoun was literally putting food on the table, something was creeping through the trees back near the family cabin. Something watching his wife and baby through the trees with wild, hungry eyes. Yarmoun wasn't all that far from the cabin and didn't hear anything that might concern him while he was out, so there was no need for him to rush back. But as he was returning to his family with a brace of rabbits, he noticed some rather large animal tracks in the snow ahead of him, and to his horror, they led in the direction of the cabin. After checking the family cabin for his partner and their infant daughter, Yarmoun found it empty, so he walked towards the nearby sauna, keeping his loaded rifle at the ready. When he was about 240 meters from the cabin, Yarmoun felt his blood turn to ice when he heard deep, angry growls coming from some bushes nearby. Whatever the foliage concealed was huge. Yarmoun turned just in time to see a huge grizzly bear charging out from the scrub just 15 meters from where he stood. Despite his terror, he managed to get 4 shots of his rifle off in as many seconds, with one of the bullets smashing into the bear's skull, killing it instantly. He had neutralized the threat, but felt his heart break in his chest when he had discovered he had been too late to save his child and her mother. Adele was lying still in a baby carrier attached to Valerie's back. Both had been mauled to death, with huge chunks of flesh missing from both their blood-soaked bodies. But grizzly attacks on humans are extremely rare, and a bear has to be truly starving and desperate to resort to human flesh for sustenance. Yet unfortunately for Yarmoun's partner and child, that's exactly the condition that this grizzly was in. A post-mortem examination performed on the 18-year-old male bear found that it was so emaciated that it would not have been capable of hibernation given its complete lack of body fat. Conservation officers said they had no idea what might cause the bear to be in such distress, so much so that it had turned to extremely uncommon food sources in its desperation, including a porcupine. That particular meal had gruesomely injured the grizzly, which was found to have multiple quills penetrating its digestive system. While officials said the death of Thierry and her infant daughter appeared to have been an unavoidable tragedy, they cautioned it showed that the danger of bear encounters remain year-round. The hibernation period in the region usually lasts from around November to late spring, but as we just heard, some bears are in no condition to hibernate. It just goes to show that even somewhere like Canada, which we think of as a civilized modern country, has vast swaths of wilderness that are simply not as accommodating as we might like to think. Even when we think we've learned the rules of Mother Nature's game, she'll just throw us a curveball that results in the tragic death of a young mother and her child. But it seems that sudden horrific deaths like that are the price we pay for mankind's continued desire to tame the great wild spaces on the earth. And so, as we go on taking from nature, so nature continues to take from us. On January 19th, 1886, a small notice appeared in the New York Times newspaper. It detailed the fate of a young girl from Ontario, Canada, who had died after quickly succumbing to a virulent and deadly illness. The girl was buried the very next day before a collection of her heartbroken relatives, but after a financial dispute with the cemetery owner, the girl's body had to be exhumed from the grave and moved to a different site. The event caused extreme anguish for the girl's grieving family members, but that level of emotional torment was to pale in comparison with what was to come. From when the coffin lid was removed from the young girl's final resting place, the gravedigger had to stifle a cry of pure horror. The girl's burial shroud had been torn to shreds, Her knees were drawn up to her chin, one of her arms was twisted under her chin, and her features bore evidence of the most dreadful torture. There were scratch marks on the underside of the coffin lid, and the girl's fingernails were torn and bloody, morbid evidence of her futile attempts to escape. The little girl had been buried alive. And horrifyingly, the act of burying people alive wasn't even all that rare at the time. It didn't help that medical science was slow to produce a reliable checklist of vital signs, on top of the fact that many doctors prior to the late 19th century were too poorly educated or incompetent to tell a living person from a dead one. It is also a fact that something of a moral panic concerning premature burials took hold in parts of Europe and North America during the 18th and early 19th centuries, the fervor of which was scarcely warranted by the facts. Historians surmise it may have been prompted by the medical discovery that victims of suffocation and drowning could be resuscitated, that though they appeared dead, they really weren't. This must have been extremely disturbing news for people at that time. For the most part, the fear of being buried alive outweighed the actual chances of it happening, and a number of measures were taken to try and avoid it. For example, if a sailor died at sea, they would be stitched up in their hammock, with the final stitch running right through their nose, just to make sure they weren't unconscious. Being buried alive is highly unlikely, but it seems that for one young Canadian girl back in 1886, it was a very real prospect that became a nightmarish reality. And as she lay 6 feet deep in the earth, screaming and scratching at the coffin lid in utter desperation, she must have prayed for her parents to dig her up. And dig her up they did. Only once it was done, they'd find they arrived just a little too late. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And catch a live stream, which I promise will be back soon, to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.